Okay, so hello everybody. Episode number 5, Visibility in Action, and today I'm joined by Emily Hamilton, who I will ask to do the cheesy self-introduction in a minute. But lots of stuff on the agenda today, everything from transitioning at work to the overall state of society in quotation marks, as Emily put in her email to me, and overall kind of unity within the LGBTQ community as well. So big topics, and I'm sure we could talk for hours about them. But yeah, let's start by letting Emily introduce herself.
Thanks, Dave. So again, I'm Emily Hamilton. I'm Vice President of Strategic Change at RS Components. I'm a trans woman, and I transitioned. I started my transition in late 2019, and I've just celebrated my first anniversary of returning to the office as the real me, because some pandemic or something got in the way.
I know, returning to the office. What's that?
Well, I've been back since the 20th of May last year.
Wow,
yeah.
That's
albeit on my own.
I was going to say, yeah, it can't have been that busy. I've not seen our new office at all. Yeah, so lots to get into with this conversation, and I think what's interesting, I suppose, and two people are never exactly the same, but comparing your experiences to Clara's that I spoke to in episode 2 are going to be interesting. You are someone who's transitioned slightly later in life for a more senior position in a large corporate business as well, and how the company's handled that, how it's been for you both professionally but also personally as well. I think there's lots of things to talk about there. So obviously 2019 seems like 3 decades ago now, but it's not that long. We're talking here 18 months, 2 years. So tell us a bit about the background there. What got you to the point of feeling you were ready to make that transition at work?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a long story. I mean, I worked out that I was very different from my peers when I was probably 6 years old. So I'm 44 now, and when you're 6, you don't really have the vocabulary. You don't really understand what it is that's different, other than I developed a pretty clear obsession about wanting to be Madonna and dance with the girls after Top of the Pops on a Thursday night, and I knew they weren't interested in that because they saw me as a boy. And I think the first time I really articulated how I felt was when I was 11. I came out to a psychologist. I was taken to for depression, and he said, "What's the problem?" I said, "Well, I'm a girl, and I don't know what's going on." And not to go into too much detail on that, but I was slammed very firmly back into the pod. It was made very clear that wasn't acceptable. That was not a sensible thing. I was very tall even then. So I mean, I was 5'11" when I was 10.
Wow.
I'm 6'7" now, and a seed was certainly sown at that point that not only was it unacceptable to be trans, even though that as a word didn't exist at that stage. But his exact words were, "You're too big for that nonsense. Pack it in. What's really wrong?" So I then spent, the following, really 30 years hiding away that part of me, and it was never completely hidden. I did some very typically masculine things, military service, rugby, things that I thought might cure me of how I felt. But as I now know, and as most sensible people know, it's not something to be cured. It's just who I am. It's how I was born. Gave myself my name, probably 20 years ago, as a way of describing this person that couldn't show themselves. And that sort of carried on until 2019, when I went through a process where actually my status was discovered by a family member. They found some clothing belonging to me.
Right.
And I attempted suicide. It was the second time in my life I've tried that, and was very, very close to the edge. I mean, quite literally the edge in this instance. And a happenstance call from an old friend to see how I was on holiday at the time, how the holiday was going. Really just talked me back over the edge. And I think that was the point where I realised I couldn't go back in the closet. I'd had that attempt at 11 to come out. I tried again when I was 21-ish, which also led to a suicide attempt. And I decided I couldn't carry on doing that. I couldn't go back in the closet and pretend. So yeah, that was August 19 that happened. I came back from holiday, came back to work, and there was a bit of a backstory there where I'd had some things delivered to work, some shoes and a wig delivered to work, and unfortunately one of my team had seen the customs label and thought that was hilarious, and I'd created a crazy story that only a Scots-Irish person could do around a Rocky Horror Show reunion party that I was going to, and you know, it was all for that. Yeah. And of course, I created a monster because when I came back, everyone wanted photographs. And I broke down to a colleague I was having lunch with and said, look, there's no party. I suffer with gender dysphoria. This is who I am. And she said, that's okay. And, you know, was absolutely fine with things. And then I went through a very rapid process of sort of coming out. So I started to talk to other people at work. I had to bite the bullet to talk to my boss, my then boss, and had to do it by phone because he wasn't there that day. He wasn't in the office. Absolute support, spoke to the chair of our support network at work for LGBTQ plus people, who is also trans, amazing guy, Preston, and had a chat in the canteen, all the while still presenting as him. And yeah, the process happened relatively rapidly. So I think the announcement went out to everyone in November that I was transitioning, that this was my identity, this is who I am. I'm a project and program professional by background, so I drew out a Gantt chart of transition, quite literally. It was very detailed. It was really took me through the next 18 months, because there's lots to think about when you transition. And then the pandemic came, and I was locked down, and that, for all sorts of reasons I won't go into, lockdown was really, really tough. So I was locked down for the first 6 weeks with everyone else. And then I had an opportunity to come back to the office, and I made the decision I wouldn't come back as him. So I pushed the button at work and said, I want to change avatar, I want to change my name. I'd already done a deed poll by that point, so I was legal. And that was it, 20th of May last year. I returned to the office as me, and no one has seen him since.
So we're just past the first anniversary then.
It is, yeah. Yeah, just it popped up. I'm starting to get to the stage where I get nice notifications on Facebook and social media of what happened a year ago. You know, so I start to get the pictures of things, you know, I want to celebrate. So, yeah.
It must be amazing. I mean, this really, it goes to shine a light on, you know, we talk about invisible diversity a lot, and what, you know, invisible can mean there is that you may not know a person is LGBTQ plus until they tell you, but it's also what is going on behind the scenes there that nobody else sees, the masks that, you know, we all have to put on. And I think for, you know, a trans person, those are even more kind of visceral, because it's not just, you know, a sexual identity, it's your identity and who you are. So, you know, I most of us across the rest of the community probably, you know, struggle to relate to just how embedded that can be in, you know, your own kind of mindset.
I think that's I think that's true. I mean, I mean, my brother's gay, cis gay guy, and you know, we talk a bit about what's happened. I mean, he came out quite late in life too. He came out a few years ago, and I remember very nearly coming out to him the same night. I thought, no, don't steal his thunder, don't trump him. You know, and I wasn't ready at that stage either. But, you know, we talk about things like travel. We talk about, you know, the experience of going places. And, you know, he likes to travel. He's he's worked all around the world. And I said to him, well, you know, I've got to be careful because, you know, it's still illegal in 70 countries to be LGBTQ plus in toto. Still 7 countries with the death penalty. And his instant reaction was, well, yeah, you don't talk about it, don't show. And I said, well, it's a bit different. You know, he worked in Saudi Arabia as a gay man. And, you know, I was terrified for him at the time. But of course, as he said, nobody knew, because unless you tell people, unless you have a footprint, unless you demonstrate in some way that you're gay, you can become invisible. And you shouldn't have to become invisible, but you can.
But you can, yeah.
So for me, I'm a 6'7" transgender woman. I'm very comfortable in that identity. You know, I've got over those problems, but I'm always going to be visible. So I have to think very carefully, and that goes the same for work. You know, even something as ridiculous as the pain of having to go in the gents' toilet. You know, I wasn't meant to be in there. That's not where I wanted to be. You know, conversations with female colleagues that I wanted to get involved in. You know, I'm a bit of a creature. I love shoes, and I'm kind of starting to love bags, which is a bit of a problem. And they would talk about handbags. They talk about, and I'd love to have joined in. I wanted to, you know, oh, you know, that's really beautiful. But you can't, because you come across as creepy cishet boss.
Yeah.
And that really hurts, because I'm one of the joys now is I have those conversations, and I have conversations I was never privy to have, because I have a part of that community, the women's community, as well as the LGBTQ plus community, because I was completely closeted before that. You know, I'm bi, but nobody knew that. You know, that's and it's you know it's irrelevant from a relationship perspective now at this point in time, but it's not something I ever felt comfortable to talk about, because I was worried somebody would find out the rest. They'd find out the secrets. And the stigma and everything else. So yeah, it's a lot of mental capacity to tie up.
Huge. I don't know if we've talked about this before recording, but had you been out as bi at work before being out as trans, or
I wasn't out as bi to anyone.
Wow. So those were simultaneous, essentially. That's a huge step as well.
Yeah.
So, I mean, something that struck me when you were talking about the conversation you had with the psychologist when you were 11. Now, if I've done my maths correctly, that is, you know, late 80s, 1988.
Yeah, 87, yeah, thereabouts.
Yeah, which is when Section 28 came in. Now, for context, we're talking here about a piece of legislation that essentially made it illegal to talk about LGBTQ plus issues in the education sector, in the public sector here in the UK. Now, that lasted until the year 2000 in Scotland, and 2003 in England and Wales.
Yeah.
So we're talking here about, you know, an atmosphere that you know, created. And, you know, we are, you know, at slightly different ages, but, you know, you're talking about something that happened right at the beginning of that. You know, I left school just as it was repealed. So it affected, you know, a huge chunk of, you know, the working population today. So us as LGBTQ people, but also our, you know, straight and cis counterparts who grew up with that kind of atmosphere that has led to some of the issues we still see today as well. And you know, the lack of allyship we see comes from some of that. So in terms of, you know, as we talk about the state of society, as you called it, I mean, this is a huge topic, and, you know, I don't necessarily want this project to come across as overtly political. But frankly, in my opinion, these issues shouldn't be political. We're talking about human rights, essentially.
Yeah.
So you know, you came out as bi, you came out as trans, you started transitioning during a spell where we're starting to see trans issues, for one, being mentioned in the media and in the news press a lot, you know, disproportionately and frankly, mostly negatively.
Yeah.
So how has that kind of backdrop affected you over the last couple of years, and the decisions you've made and the conversations you've had professionally?
It's a terrifying time. I mean, there's no two ways about it. And you're quite right. It gets painted as a political thing, and it's not about politics, about human rights. No one in the LGBTQ plus community wants anything more than equal rights. We're not asking for special pleadings or anything additional. And on a personal perspective, it is terrifying. I mean, it's tiring as well. So you're right. I mean, somebody did some research this week. The average for some of the broadsheet newspapers in this country is that they're running, you know, sort of at least two stories a week, negative stories about trans people. The BBC has run a number of really very ill-founded stories about trans people, and that narrative breaks through. It's not my experience in general society. Most people I interact with and interface with are respectful, don't care, or actively avoid, but and I've had a few, actually what you would classify as hate crime incidents where I've been abused on the street, which I'd rather didn't happen. But for the vast majority of people, we are just people. We're just getting on with things, and yeah, we're maybe a bit peculiar. It's not an experience they can relate to. In terms of my decision making, I mean, it's often said that there was sort of a golden moment to be trans, which was around sort of 2015, 2016. And I do know some people who transitioned at that stage who said they really felt the corner had been turned, that things were improving. And it almost feels like there's a backlash at the moment. It feels like trans is the wedge issue. The fact that we're called an issue. I'm not an issue. I'm a human being. I'm a woman who's just trying to live her life.
Yeah.
We're definitely in reverse. The ILGA rankings say that. We're only slightly above Russia in the ILGA rankings for trans rights, and so it hasn't made a difference in my decision making, because I think I got to the stage where I didn't have a choice. It wasn't a choice for me.
Yeah.
The choice was to live or die, and I was persuaded that living was more important. I have a daughter, and speaking rationally now, I wouldn't put her through losing a parent in that way. But it does make me think about everything I do. So one of the things I often talk about is having been perceived for many years as a cis white middle-aged guy. That's the golden ticket in life. It's the direct route from A to B. I now have to zigzag. It's something that a good friend talked about when I first came out. I've got to learn to look for those diagonals now. How do I get to where I want to get to? And that's metaphorically in terms of thinking about how I interact with people, but it's also physically. So the things I used to be able to do, I want to go somewhere, I go somewhere. Nobody's going to mess about with me. I'm just doing my thing. I now have to think and double think and think again.
Yeah.
Things like access to healthcare is just, my access to healthcare is massively compromised. And those are things I never had to think about before. So, the NHS is there, and we all celebrate and salute the NHS. But for trans healthcare, it's effectively absent. I approached my GP in the October of 2019 and asked for a referral for the gender identity clinic. My GP sat on that until the March of 2020.
Right.
I chased them up, and I'm not going to be seen even for a first appointment at the earliest until the middle of 2023.
Wow.
And these are things I never had to consider before, because my general healthcare needs would either have been met there or met through company healthcare schemes. But most company healthcare schemes specifically exclude trans people. So I'm now in a position where I'm having to raise funds for surgeries and raising funds. I'm paying privately for my transition healthcare. These are all things which they're just points I now have to consider all the time. How will I pay for that? How will I manage my finances? How will I manage my life? But yeah, as I say, did it make a difference in whether I would come out or not? No, because I was at that stage in life. Do I fear that it means for other people who are in a similar position and perhaps younger, that they're thinking, my God, I can't come out in this environment? I do fear that's the case. And I fear they're going to build up, not only for younger people, the physical manifestations of the wrong puberty. You can hear that with me. My voice is awful. I hate my voice. I have to work on that. I've gone through painful laser hair removal. I'm going through all sorts of processes to undo that puberty. And I do feel that younger people will be put off by this hostile environment. And it's getting worse. It seems to be getting worse day by day.
Yeah. No, and it's horrible to read, the sort of article after article, all almost talking about the same misinformation. Let's call it what it is. That, yeah, I can't kind of imagine how that must feel in the minds of particularly younger people who aren't out yet, and it's I think a very, we talk about the similarities across everyone in the LGBTQ plus, banner, and there are similarities for us all in the, the idea of coming out, for one. It's something we all do, but it's a very different experience for every individual, never mind every letter in the acronym. But for trans and for non-binary people as well, I think that's a very different experience, because your identity as a trans woman and your identity as a bi woman are two separate things. And that's, I suppose, brings us neatly on to the other topic we want to cover, which is the idea of kind of, well, community, and how the unity within the LGBTQ plus community is so important. I don't know if anyone else has read, but this week there's a journalist called Matthew Paris, I forget his name now, it's for the Times, who was involved in setting up Stonewall, and is a gay man who's been very vocal as a journalist for many years. Let's not get into his politics, but is now writing about how Stonewall is doing too much, apparently, for the trans community, and the focus should be on the L, the G, and the B, which seems insane to me if you look at Stonewall as a point in history and who was involved in the quote unquote riots. So unity in the community, speaking as a bi person and as a trans person, what does that mean to you, and what do we need to do better?
It's a big thing for me, and I think what we're starting to see is an attempt to fracture the community. And it's well funded, but opaquely funded. Excuse me. It's opaquely funded. You can't tell where the money's coming from, but you can make a good guess. And we saw the LGB Alliance created over the last year or so, who are overtly transphobic. I mean, their mission seems to be transphobic, and to suggest that transition is an alternative to being lesbian, gay, or bisexual. Although, to be fair, they don't do much for bi people either. And what you now see is this, and the attacks on Stonewall have been relentless, and it does feel very coordinated. Stonewall is an amazing charity, set up by a number of people, in the 80s as a direct response to the Section 28 question. And I was reading some things this week, and I think it suffers from a problem they sort of call founder syndrome within the third sector, which is you have people who found something, but they want the baby to always be their baby. And I look at some of the other founders. I look at Ian McKellen, I look at Michael Cashman. They are staunch defenders of all of the people under the umbrella of Stonewall, because they recognise that the attacks on trans people are the same attacks that were given to gay and lesbian people in the 80s and 90s. I remember them well. It was a terribly hostile environment. There's nothing original going on. So when people say to me, and I see it asked, almost sometimes innocently from within the community, should trans be different from LGB because it's a different thing? It's not sexuality, it's identity. My answer is no, it shouldn't be, because firstly, many people in the trans community are also lesbian, gay, or bisexual. Sexuality and gender identity are different things, but there is a massive intersection. Secondly, the attacks come from the same places. They come from the same root. They come from the same root of bigotry, of fear, of othering a small minority group. And we can only defend ourselves if we stand together. What's the catchphrase for Michael Cashman is "together, only together," and he's absolutely right. So, to suggest that there is some conflict of rights between trans people and lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, or for that matter, trans people and women, or trans people and men, for that matter, that there's some sort of intersection of rights, is a wholly false premise based on lies. Let's call them out for what they are, and bigotry. And Stonewall has always stood against bigotry, and I'm very grateful for them. I'm grateful for the fact that they became very trans inclusive a number of years ago. It's always been implicit in their mission, but they became very explicit about it a few years ago, which is where you started getting these divisions and these cracks. And I think they became explicit because they saw the environment changing. They reacted to the external environment. And that is the job of a charity that campaigns for human rights. It has to react to the external environment.
Yes, I know, completely. And I think, exactly as you say, a lot of the attacks we're seeing on the trans community now are, you know, verbatim the attacks that were being put on, you know, the gay community in particular through the 80s, you know, as a result of the AIDS pandemic and, you know, of Section 28 coming in. And they're things that, you know, for, you know, just speaking personally here, I grew up as someone, and still am someone who people assume to be straight. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's, you know, the rugby and the heavy metal, who knows. But you then are given an insight into those conversations that people have when they think they're in a safe space to, you know, speak what they see as freely. And it's exactly the same things that, you know, you hear people talking about the trans community that I heard as a teenager that prevented me from, you know, being openly bi. So they don't seem necessarily to come from a genuine place, but more of this constructive narrative that I don't quite understand what their end goal is. In all honesty, I really don't. But
there is no reason to it. I mean, phobias by definition are irrational fears. And, you know, homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, lesbophobia, they're all irrational, and they're based on, they have to be based on lies to make any sense to people. You know, to suggest that just because I now present as the person I am, that I've suddenly become a rapist. I've been called a rapist in public at a petrol station, you know, which was terrifying.
I can imagine.
Is so patently absurd. To suggest that because I'm trans, I'm a danger to children is patently absurd. To suggest that I have an interest in recruiting people to the LGBTQ plus community, I have no interest. I don't need to. We're being born all the time. You know, people are born as we are. I don't need to go and recruit them. I have no interest in making a cis person trans or a straight person bi or lesbian or gay. You know, but what I also insist on is that if we're born trans, lesbian, gay, bisexual, that you don't try and make us straight and cis. And that's where this whole conversion therapy question that's going on at the moment, I almost hate calling it, it's not therapy in the slightest, it's torture. You know, what happened to me when I was 11, one could argue, was a very mild case of conversion therapy. And even when I first came out and I was referred, because the GP had no idea what to do, I was referred to psychosexual counselling, which for a trans person, well, I don't need psychosexual counselling. You know, the horror of the counsellor when I talked about going on to HRT, the horror for her at loss of function, for want of a better word. It was bizarre. You know, I've spent 3 sessions talking about how I am a woman, how that is how I felt for my whole life. Why on earth would I want to function as a man? I'm thrilled that HRT makes me not function like a man.
Yeah, that's the point.
Exactly.
Do you think, you know, and maybe this is a question that we can't answer today, we might kind of leave open-ended, is the conflation of gender and sexuality the basis of a lot of these problems? People conflating the two and not necessarily understanding that there's a difference, and education is a big part of that problem.
Maybe. I mean, I think the majority of people who are vocal and are influential start from a bad faith perspective, and they influence people who are simply ignorant of the facts. So I don't think you can say it's a lack of understanding of the barriers. I think they're coming in with a bad faith argument. For the people who are, you know, the usual suspects who will say, you know, I've got nothing against LGBTQ plus people. I just don't want trans women in my bathroom. You can be sure that if they are successful in preventing me from living my life publicly, and by living my life publicly, I mean simply being able to go to the toilet when I'm out in public, being able to go and buy clothes in a clothes shop, being, you know, treated with a modicum of respect. You can be sure if those things are removed, that won't be the end of it. You know, then who is the target? Who does it go to next? And I think that's where there's a massive intersection across all elements of diversity in our society. You know, you raised Matthew Parris. I mean, a week before Matthew Parris was saying Stonewall shouldn't be working with trans people, he was also saying that the traveller way of life should be eradicated. I mean, using those words. These are the roots of genocide.
Yep.
This is where it starts. It starts with what sound like reasonable suggestions and agreements, and people are, well, maybe there's something to discuss here.
And it goes up and
We
up.
know where it ends. You know,
And this is the
there is a
problem.
pyramid.
Yeah, this is the problem with kind of that sensationalist journalism. And I do think, you know, this is a whole other topic, but I do think, you know, this is the sociology graduate in me talking now, the quote unquote downfall of the printed press now does mean that we are seeing clickbait become not just a YouTube problem, not just an Instagram problem, but a media and journalism problem, because you know they're striving for those clicks and ultimately therefore looking for the most sensationalist headlines, the biggest stories that they can tell, whether they're based in truth or not. And I don't necessarily think some of this stuff is written purely out of malice. Some of it is written for the click without thinking of the consequences.
Yeah.
And both are as dangerous as each other. And that's
and they feed off each other. I mean, the clicks for like, they require that pseudo-scientific. I mean, it's a very British brand of transphobia and homophobia where they weave this sort of pseudo-scientific element into it. And it's actually no different to what we saw in the 50s in terms of the race debate, where this bizarre concept of scientific racism was a thing. You know, oh, we can't have black people in sports because they have genetic advantages, and then they would go on to say the most outlandish and offensive things about why it was unfair to have black people playing sports with white people. And now, thankfully, we look back on that and say, what a ridiculous crock. But there were the papers there were academics positing this stuff, and they were being taken seriously. It's exactly what you get today. And it's, you know, again, bigotry, yeah, exactly. Moral panic, culture wars, you know, to suit political arguments. And to kind of draw this back to the sort of workplace question, you know, it's Pride Month. You know, lots and lots of businesses with rainbows on their logos, changing their products in some cases. You know, we've all seen white Skittles and, you know, rainbow Oreos and that sort of thing. The question is, what are those organizations doing? Okay, this is happening now. This is real. This is impacting their staff. And it's impacting their staff not just on a human basis, but on a functional basis. If you are under attack all the time, you're not going to function at work. So what are they doing? So let's think about America is a very good case in point. 133, although 3 got knocked out last night, thankfully, anti-trans bills in state houses in the US at the moment. What are companies with a US presence doing about that? What are they saying about, well, I've got trans staff, I've got family members of staff who are trans, and they're having to consider, do they move out of state? You know, what can they do? Are they having to scrimp and save? Are they getting into debt because they're having to pay for medical care that's been withdrawn? Companies have a moral obligation to stand up and say they won't invest in countries or states that follow these sort of laws. And I think they've got a massive power there as well. And it's not enough to change your logo. It's not enough to say we are inclusive. What do you mean by inclusivity? Do you mean inclusivity in healthcare plans for your staff? Do you mean that you speak up? You stand up for Stonewall? Well, that's a great example. Diversity Champion Scheme, absolutely under assault. Companies getting emails and letters, you know, from organised groups saying you should pull out because it's promoting a gender agenda that we don't agree with. It's time for companies not only just to ignore those or say, well, they're just cranks, but be public and say, no, we are part of that because we value the humanity of our staff. We value the humanity of our customers. It's not just staff, it's customers. You know, I'm a customer, I buy things from people. I even buy stuff from recruitment consultants, you know, and I have to say, I will judge that organization based on how it responds to me. You know, if I'm misgendered, if I feel that I'm being treated less favorably, I'm not going to do business with you. And I think that's something that corporations really do need to ponder. Now is the time not for lip service or colours. Now is the time to speak up and speak out.
Definitely.
It's exactly the same for race. It's a year since the murder of George Floyd. These are not politics. These are not political questions. These are questions of human rights.
Yep, totally agree. Totally agree. And I think that whole idea of, you know, rainbow capitalism and, you know, the pink pound, all these phrases we've heard over the years, ultimately it's not enough just to do that. And I think we've seen, even just over the last week or two, we've seen Lego coming under, getting a lot of plaudits for releasing their Pride box. And great, you know what, these things are fantastic. If you can get that as a child, and even just the rainbow logo becoming normalized, brilliant. They're clearly doing something right, and any form of allyship is good.
Yes.
But there's allyship, and then there's actually being proactive and doing
There's
something.
active allyship.
Exactly.
Being an ally is not self-ID, right? Self-ID is a big thing in my community. Self-ID is not for allies. You can't just say, I am an ally. I want to know how you're an ally. Got to be active.
Yep. And you know what? Even that first individual at your work that you spoke to and said it was okay, that's proactive allyship. It doesn't have to be a huge, grand gesture. It means being there at the right time and being supportive as well.
They changed name and pronouns straight away. Even before I changed my presentation full stop at work. I had a coming out party. They came to the coming out party, which was a fabulous night, and I'm missing being able to go out.
Yeah.
But they were there. They were in that space. They were in a safe space for me. They were in an LGBTQ plus club, straight white women, but they came and they had a fabulous time, and they are true allies.
Yeah, absolutely.
They are there standing up. They are saying, this is, you're my friend, you're my sister. I mean, they call me their sister now, the friends I have at work.
Which is amazing.
That makes all the difference to me.
It's these little things. I've had my pronouns on LinkedIn for quite a long time, but Solutions Driven as a company took the decision a few months ago now to incorporate that in our email signatures as well. Something I frankly should have done a long time ago. But actually, since doing that, I've had several replies from people I'm reaching out to from a sales perspective. They have no idea who I am whatsoever, but asking, what's with this he/him thing in your email signatures? A lot of people I reach out to, English might be a second language, so they might not be familiar necessarily with that approach. And when I've then replied explaining, it's, to promote visibility and inclusivity, every single reply I've had has been, oh, I've never thought of that before. That's a great idea. I'm going to do it too.
Yeah.
And it's those little things.
It is those little things. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, let's leave it on that positive note, shall we? But thank you so much for your time, Emily. It's been really good to talk to you. And I think these issues are hugely, hugely important. And I think it's a conversation that needs to be happening far, far wider. So it's great that you're, being this visible and, talking, about your experiences like this, because I think it can only help other people who, might be in a similar position, and help them not reach that breaking point that, sadly you and many others have had to get to be where you are today.
Thank you, Dave.
Not at all. Great talking to you.